Hey, welcome to Zero Hangout TV. I'm your host, Phoenix Trinidad. We are breaking down our predicted lineups for the preliminary finals coming up, and to do that with me, as always, is Mitch Keating. How are you, mate?
Good, mate. I'm good.
Good. Already prelim week. Let's get straight into it. So, first game is Friday night at the SCG, Sydney, after coming off that qualifying final win. We're looking at just one change potentially, with Callum Mills ruled out.
Yeah, that hamstring injury, obviously very untimely. Frustrating for their skipper, who's had a pretty interrupted year already. But yeah, ruled out of the prelim and potentially the grand final if they make it. But I think they won't be making any calls until next week if they're still within reach. So probably opens the door back up for Taylor Adams, who was the heartbreak story of last year's grand final with Collingwood. Came up to Sydney in hope of some better opportunity, and he's unfortunately come at a time when they've had two or three players really step up in midfield groups. So he probably comes back in, maybe as the sub. It's probably going to be him or Robbie Fox, you think, in Cal Mills' absence. Braden Campbell comes into a starting role, kind of offers that defensive structure and setup that Mills can bring. And he was absolutely superb as well as the sub against the Giants a couple of weeks ago. So Taylor Adams is probably the one that comes back in, which is a nice story, and he might be able to have a shot on grand final day this year as well.
Yep, absolutely. So how about Port now? So Ken Hinkley, a bit of a redemption upcoming, hopefully. So one change, we're thinking Charlie Dixon for Todd Marshall.
Yeah, well, we thought it was going to be the reverse for last week's semi-final against Hawthorn, but obviously Dixon and Marshall were both set to play before Dixon was ruled out late with illness. So now that Todd Marshall's ruled out with concussion, I think that should be pretty straightforward. Ollie Lord's probably the other one that they could consider bringing in if Dixon's not up for it come Friday night. But you'd think it might just be the one change. They had, I think, 3 changes all up for the semi-final. Jed McEntee got dropped, which I think was a bit unfortunate. He could come back in if they want him over Will Lorenz in that sub role, but both were available last week and Lorenz got the gig instead. Ryan Burton missed with that calf injury. I probably wouldn't have him playing. They would want to avoid any risk, but if he can turn it around pretty quickly, he'll be in line for a potential return. That could push Josh Shin back out or move Darcy Byrne-Jones around, but a little bit to play out there. Kane Farrell's the other one that Ken Hinkley didn't rule him out. They said his season was over after round 24 with that hamstring injury, but now that they're potentially looking at a grand final, he could be playing next week. But there's some suggestion he could be available as early as this week. So there's a bit to play out for the Power, but maybe it might just be the one change. Dixon back in from illness, and obviously Todd Marshall has to be replaced.
Yep, absolutely. So looking at this matchup, what do you reckon? It's going to be an interesting one.
I think everyone's probably just going to tip the Swans, but Power did beat them by 19 goals like 6 weeks ago. So it's kind of been that season. You don't really know what to expect. You'd like to think that the Swans are the extra week off. I think they'll go in as favourites rightfully, but it's such an interesting matchup to think that they would do it comfortably compared to the last time they played off, and given the last time that the Swans beat the Power was years and years ago. So they've certainly got one over them, the Power, but I think the Swans get it done at home.
Yeah, I'm predicting the Swans by about 2 goals and maybe Ken Hinkley to mouth off to Papley. So looking ahead to Saturday night at the MCG, we've got Geelong, Brisbane, some interesting ones for Geelong. So they've probably got the most changes, and we're starting with Tom Stewart.
Yeah, well, he sounds like a confirmed in. Had the hamstring injury, obviously, before the qualifying final, was actually ruled out with illness, and he's training fine and ticking all boxes. So he'll play. And then it's the questions are who else comes in and who else makes way. So I would like to think is that Sam De Koning would come in to kind of tackle the Brisbane front third, probably the most lethal attack you'd might side of Geelong in the competition, with Danaher, Hipwood, Logan Morris, and some kind of ground level threats as well. So you probably have Henry and De Koning taking some tools. Cole Justin and Guthrie can kind of both go separate options as well, play taller, play smaller. But the one that I thought would get squeezed out most other weeks would be Jed Buse, but he's had a pretty good history on Charlie Cameron, and I think he's the one to go to him. 2 years ago when these two clubs played off in the preliminary final, Geelong won by I think 70-odd points, and Jed Buse kept Charlie Cameron to 8 touches and 1 goal. So he probably holds his spot. What that means, though, is it's probably either Zach Guthrie or Mitch Duncan that come out of the side. Look, there's going to be cutthroat calls everywhere at Kardinia Park this week. Duncan maybe the sub and Tui as the emergency. Could very easily be the other way around. Look, Buse might be the unlucky one as well. It's just very difficult to predict how Chris Scott's going to line up this week. And we haven't even factored in Tom Hawkins, Cam Guthrie.
Yeah.
Both came through the VFL, both look readily available, but I just can't possibly see them bringing Tom Hawkins in ahead of Shannon Neal, who's kicked goals in every game. I think he's 23 goals from 14 games, which is a great turnover for third tall forward option. Played his role exactly what he needed to do against Port Adelaide. I think he'd be very stiff to get dropped, as good as Tom Hawkins is. But I think too far between games for him, and also probably the form he had before he got injured as well.
Yeah.
Had some question marks. Cam Guthrie as well. I think he hasn't played since mid-May at AFL level. 4 games for the year after having a quad injury earlier in the season. So I'd probably just avoid risks altogether. As good as these two are, or 3 even with Tui, it's going to be quite difficult to narrow this down to 23. But this is, I think, the best option for Geelong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty hard to force too many changes, especially coming off that win against Port Adelaide 2 weeks ago. And look, I know you're an 8th Irish, but a little bit of a anti-Irish sentiment going on here.
No, Oisin Mullins are probably a pretty obvious out.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there for now
Yeah.
with him replacing Stewart a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, like I said, Tui's unlucky. It's just so happens that it's the 2 Irish boys. Mark O'Connor's unfit, so we can. Unfortunately, no Irish flag getting flown at the MCG on Saturday.
Yeah, unfortunate. So, all right. So looking over to Brisbane, coming off that inspired comeback against GWS, heartbreaking with GWS. So we're not looking at any changes for Brisbane this week.
Yeah, I think it just go in as named. Should be pretty straightforward, which is pretty nice for them, given that's what they had the week before as well. So Jack Payne got through enough. Obviously struggled in those first 3 quarters against Jesse Hogan, but I think he kept him touchless in the last quarter. So that's going to be a big confidence booster for Jack Payne heading into this week. Connor McKenna probably just holds that sub role. I think we were thinking Ainsworth, but Ainsworth had quite a strong semi-final performance, so rightfully deserves that starting spot. Lachie Neale's probably the big talking point in a moon boot, nursing that heel injury that he said had a bit of trouble with over the last 8 to 10 weeks, and he said it flared up for the first time over the weekend. So that's a bit of a watch, but it sounds like it'd take a lot more than that to rule him out of playing, and Chris Fagan's definitely going to have him lining up against the Cats on Saturday. Now, there are a couple of watches. Bruce Revel and Shadow Brain had, I think it was hamstring and shoulder injuries respectively in the VFL, so yet to hear from the Lions how significant they are, but if they're required or needed to be on standby, they might not be able to line up at all this weekend, so that it's just obviously among the emergencies, but bit of a shuffle that they'd like to have obviously more options on standby if needed. So unchanged, pretty much the exact same. And why wouldn't you with how up and about they'd be off the back of Saturday's win?
Yep, absolutely. So looking at that one at the MCG, unfortunately not in Geelong, but how do you think this one goes?
I think it's the Lions.
Yeah?
Narrow.
Interesting.
Like, not to stay with the theme of what we've seen over the weekend, but I think a very, very small margin to separate these two, and I think it's Brisbane that get the job done. Yeah,
and they have been just rolling with some momentum, especially in the back end of this season. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm back in Geelong, probably a tight one again, like maybe between 1 or 2 goals, but I think it's just Geelong. I reckon it's just easy. Well, that wraps it up for our team predictions for the preliminary finals. So what else we got in the pipeline?
Well, obviously, plenty of preview content coming up for these 2 games. They're going to be absolutely massive contests. Obviously, grand final week next week, so that kicks off with Brownlow night next Monday. So we're going to have plenty of, pre-count analysis as well. So you can get all of that on zerohanger.com, and then obviously heaps rolling into the season decider. So the next 2 weeks going to be action-packed, and plenty to unfold.
Absolutely. All right, well, that wraps it up. And don't forget, catch all the latest AFL news at zerohanger.com.